What's one moment that made you go, that's it, I'm done?
I remember the exact moment when everything shifted for me in ways I could never have anticipated. Sitting there in the dim glow of my kitchen after a grueling 12-hour shift at the hospital where I'd spent the day tending to patients whose stories of hardship paled in comparison to the quiet desperation building in my own life as a 48-year-old divorced nurse in suburban Dayton, Ohio, with the weight of rheumatoid arthritis already gnawing at my joints like an unrelenting intruder. That promised to upend the fragile stability I'd clawed together over the years since my ex-husband walked out a decade earlier, leaving me to raise our two children through their turbulent teens on a salary that stretched thin across mortgage payments, college tuitions, and the occasional family bailout that always seemed to fall on my shoulders alone. It was one of those impulsive decisions born from exhaustion and a fleeting hope for escape, purchasing a single lottery ticket on my way home from work because the jackpot had ballooned to an absurd $250 million, the kind of sum that headlines splashed across every local newsstand and billboard along the interstate, whispering promises of freedom to folks like me who had long since stopped dreaming big but couldn't quite kill the spark entirely. So when I scratched off the numbers later that evening with trembling hands fueled by cheap coffee and lingering adrenaline, the revelation hit me like a freight train, barreling through the mundane routine of my existence, confirming that yes, those digits matched perfectly, transforming my ordinary split-level house with its peeling paint and cluttered garage into the gateway of a hidden empire that could erase debts, fund treatments for my worsening condition, and perhaps even allow me to slip away to a sunnier state where the cold winters didn't exacerbate the pain shooting through my fingers and knees like electric currents. But even in that euphoric haze, I double-checked the ticket against the official draw on my phone while pacing the linoleum floor that echoed with the ghosts of family gatherings long faded into obligation. A deep-seated caution rooted in years of witnessing how sudden windfalls twisted relationships in the emergency room tales patients shared during vulnerable moments overrode any impulse to celebrate openly or reach for the phone to dial up relatives who had taken my support for granted time and again, from lending money to my brother Mike for a string of failed ventures that left him perpetually chasing the next big break in real estate or multi-level marketing schemes, to dropping everything during my sister Lisa's multiple divorces where I'd played the role of emotional anchor and occasional financial lifeline without ever expecting reciprocity, because that's just what family did. Or so I'd convinced myself through the lens of Midwestern values that prized endurance over entitlement. The decision to keep the wind shrouded in secrecy crystallized almost immediately as I contacted a discreet lawyer named Harlan through a referral from a colleague, a no-frills attorney in his 60s with a reputation for handling high-stakes matters quietly who advised cashing the prize through a trust to minimize publicity and taxes, leaving me with a net sum substantial enough to redefine my future yet vulnerable to the very people closest to me if word leaked out, especially now that my doctor's recent diagnosis had escalated from manageable flares to a prognosis warning of potential disability that might force me out of the job I both resented and relied upon. The kind of career that had honed my skepticism toward human nature after seeing spouses abandon the ill, siblings squabble over inheritances at deathbeds, and friends vanish when the going got tough. With that in mind, bolstered by the quiet thrill of holding such power in reserve, I began a subtle outreach to my scattered family, not with direct pleas that might raise suspicions, but with measured requests framed around my health crisis, starting with a text to Lisa about needing help navigating some medical paperwork amid a rough patch that was affecting my mobility and focus. The message crafted to evoke the sisterly bond we'd shared in childhood before life pulled us into separate orbits of resentment and routine, yet as the hours turned to days without a reply, her social media feed continued to buzz with updates on her latest craft, beer tastings and romantic escapades with a partner who seemed more interested in her wallet than her well-being, a pattern that stung with the familiarity of past slights where my reliability had been met with selective amnesia. Undeterred but increasingly disheartened, I followed up with a call to Mike, my older brother whose life had become a carousel of half-baked ideas, from flipping undervalued properties in the Rust Belt neighborhoods to peddling supplements at weekend markets, pitching The conversation as a simple ask for advice on possibly relocating if my condition worsened. Perhaps even borrowing his truck for a scouting trip to warmer climates like Arizona or Florida, where so many Ohioans dreamed of retiring to escape the gray skies and bone-chilling winds. But his response came laced with distracted apologies about being buried in a promising deal that demanded all his energy, promising to connect soon while his tone carried the undertone of someone already mentally filing away the request as an inconvenience to revisit only if it served his agenda, leaving me to hang up with a hollow echo in the line that mirrored the emptiness settling in my chest. Aunt Rita, the matriarchal figure on my mother's side who had always dispensed unsolicited wisdom at holiday dinners laced with passive-aggressive jabs about everyone's life choices from career paths to marital statuses, received an email from me outlining the basics of my flare-up and inquiring about her experiences with similar ailments during her own bout with fibromyalgia years back, hoping her nosy nature might draw her into offering practical support like recommendations for specialists or even a visit to help organize my cluttered home office filled with bills and prescription bottles. But her reply arrived promptly only to forward a chain of dubious remedies involving herbal teas and positive affirmations that smacked of avoidance, her postscript inquiring more about my finances than my symptoms in a way that made me pause and reconsider the depth of familial ties I'd long idealized. Even Cousin Tom, the affable charmer who'd inherited our grandfather's easy charisma and parlayed it into a middling sales job at the local car dealership before the economy soured and left him scraping by with side gigs in fantasy sports leagues and odd jobs, got a nudge through Facebook Messenger about moral support during this uncertain time, perhaps joining me for coffee to talk through options for scaling back work without derailing my independence, yet his acknowledgement boiled down to a generic thumbs-up reaction followed by radio silence. His profile updates revealing hours spent debating trades in his online gaming community rather than addressing the vulnerability I'd laid bare. As these non-responses accumulated like unanswered prayers in the quiet of my evenings spent applying heat packs and scrolling through support forums for others navigating chronic illness alone, a profound isolation took root despite the fortune burning a hole in my metaphorical pocket, prompting reflections on whether this test of loyalty was self-inflicted cruelty or a necessary reckoning with the imbalances that had defined my role as the family's unspoken safety net, and just when the weight of it all threatened to crush my resolve on a particularly rainy afternoon with thunder rumbling like distant accusations, my phone vibrated with an unexpected call from a number tied to Ellie, my estranged cousin who'd drifted to the periphery after her own bitter divorce and subsequent struggles that had kept her off the family radar for years. Her voice emerging tentative yet laced with genuine concern as she explained hearing whispers of my situation through mutual acquaintances and offering to drive over from her place 2 hours away to lend a hand without prying into details. But beneath that warmth lingered a subtle edge in her words, a hesitation that sparked an undercurrent of intrigue and wariness in me, making me wonder if this solitary response heralded true solidarity or masked intentions that could unravel the careful web of secrecy I'd woven around my life-altering windfall. That unexpected call from Ellie replayed in my thoughts long after I'd hung up, her voice carrying a mix of concern and something unspoken that kept me glancing at my phone throughout the following days as the silence from the rest of the family deepened into a deliberate void, confirming in the most disheartening way that the bonds I'd nurtured through years of one-sided generosity were as fragile as the paper doctor's notes piling up on my kitchen counter, each unanswered message a reminder of how I'd become the invisible pillar holding up lives that crumbled the moment I leaned on them for even a fraction of the support I'd extended without question during crises ranging from Mike's bankruptcy scares that had me co-signing loans I knew he'd never repay fully to Lisa's tearful nights after yet another failed relationship where I'd listened endlessly while she dissected every detail without once inquiring about my own mounting exhaustion from juggling night shifts and solo parenting. With the lottery winnings secured in that trust Harlan had set up, a safety net that mocked the very instability my family ignored, I turned my restless energy toward subtle investigations fueled by the kind of late-night insomnia that arthritis pain only amplified, Starting with Lisa's online presence, where her curated posts of glamorous outings clashed glaringly with the undercurrents of financial strain I suspected from offhand comments she'd made during our last awkward lunch, so I delved into public records and consumer forums under an anonymous alias, uncovering a web of high-interest payday loans tied to her name that explained the flashy purchases as desperate bids to maintain an illusion of success amid her part-time library job that barely covered rent on her overpriced apartment. And rather than confront her directly, which might shatter the fragile test I was running, I opted for a clever anonymous tip to the state's Attorney General's office, highlighting the predatory practices of her lenders with specifics pulled from her own careless social shares, watching over the next week as complaints surged and her feed filled with frustrated rants about bureaucratic hassles that delayed her important transactions. A petty revenge that brought a sardonic smile to my lips, because if she could afford weekend wine tours with that sleazy boyfriend of hers, surely she'd find time to answer a sister's plea, though the humor soured quickly into a bitter acknowledgement of how these so-called loved ones treated vulnerability like an inconvenience to be swiped away like a spam notification. Mike's brush-off lingered even more sharply, his promise to circle back evaporating into the ether as I recalled the storage unit full of his latest real estate flip disasters that I'd helped clear out last fall without a thank you beyond a six-pack of off-brand beer. So with a mix of curiosity and calculated payback, I posed as a prospective investor on a local realty forum, feeding just enough details from his public listings to prompt questions about overlooked code violations in his properties that I'd noted during visits, the thread exploding into debates that caught the eye of county inspectors who scheduled unannounced audits. The fallout reaching me indirectly through a family gossip chain where Mike vented about sabotage from jealous competitors in a voice message that had me chuckling over my heating pad despite the twinge in my elbows, thinking what a pack of self-absorbed opportunists they all were, circling wagons only when their own schemes teetered on collapse while ignoring the real collapse happening in my joints and resolve. Aunt Rita's evasive remedies had grated from the start, her email chain reeking of the same multi-level marketing traps she'd peddled at every reunion since Dad passed. So I traced the supplement links back to regulatory warnings about false claims and contaminated batches, then forwarded the documentation anonymously to her church group and book club email lists with a note on protecting seniors from scams, the ripple effect hitting swiftly as her next newsletter turned defensive with apologies for misinformation and promises of refunds that left her scrambling to salvage her side income, a witty deflection that spared me the energy of a direct call while underscoring the irony of her preaching family unity from a pedestal built on exploitation, her forwarded prayers now feeling like hollow echoes in the face of my unheeded reality. Even Tom, with his easygoing facade masking deeper insecurities from the auto industry's decline that had derailed his once promising path, deserved a nudge after his emoji-only reply. His online rants and fantasy football chats revealing unpaid dues and heated disputes with league mates over bets he couldn't cover, so I submitted a neutral report to the platform's moderators citing harassment in his trash talk that veered personal, resulting in a temporary ban that sparked a mini-family uproar when he blamed external forces in group texts, the chaos providing a fleeting amusement amid my swelling ankles, but also a poignant reminder of how these small revenges, while satisfying in their precision, highlighted the loneliness of wielding secret power against those who'd never earned my trust in the first place. By the time Saturday rolled around with its overcast skies mirroring my mood, Ellie pulled into my driveway right on schedule in her reliable old sedan loaded with groceries and a warmth that cut through the chill. Her arrival a stark contrast to the ghosts of neglect as she bustled into the kitchen, insisting on cooking a simple meal while we tackled the stack of medical forms I'd prepared. Her practical suggestions drawn from her own post-divorce rebuild as a graphic designer freelancing from a modest apartment after losing everything to her ex's addictions, flowing naturally into stories of resilience that eased the tension in my shoulders for the first time in weeks. Yet as we bonded over shared cups of tea amid the clutter of pill bottles and unopened mail, she reached into her bag and pulled out a worn envelope containing a letter from our grandmother dated decades earlier. its faded ink detailing a long-suppressed family dispute over an inheritance that Uncle Jack, Mike and Lisa's father, had allegedly manipulated to favor his side, the words painting a picture of betrayal that echoed too closely with my current isolation and made me question if Ellie's timely help stemmed from pure kinship or a deeper motive tied to unresolved grievances that could either mend or further fracture the fragile threads connecting us all, especially when she casually mentioned finding a related photo that might change everything if I was willing to hear the full tale. Ellie's revelation about that old letter from Grandma hung in the air between us like a threadbare curtain hiding decades of family skeletons, her fingers tracing the edges of the envelope as she elaborated on how she'd stumbled upon it while clearing out her late mother's attic after the divorce settlement left her with little more than memories and mounting legal fees. The contents detailing not just the inheritance squabble, but specific accusations against Uncle Jack for altering documents to redirect assets meant for the daughters of his sister, our mothers, toward his own children, Mike and Lisa, in a move that had poisoned relationships and driven wedges deeper than any holiday argument over politics or portion sizes at the dinner table. And as she spoke with a quiet intensity that contrasted her usual reserved demeanor, I felt a reluctant kinship forming in the way her eyes mirrored my own guarded hope for something resembling solidarity amid the betrayals piling up like unpaid bills on my desk, prompting me to share fragments of my health struggles in return, describing the relentless ache that had me popping painkillers like candy and contemplating life-altering decisions without a single relative stepping up except her. Though even that admission carried an undercurrent of wariness because trust, once shattered by those closest, rebuilds slower than a house after a flood in this part of Ohio, where everyone knows the neighbor's business, but keeps their own locked tight. The afternoon stretched into evening with us sorting through my medical paperwork side by side, her freelance graphic design background proving unexpectedly handy as she organized the chaotic stack into digital files with notes on potential appeals for better insurance coverage or community aid programs that I'd overlooked in my fog of fatigue. Her suggestions practical and devoid of pity, which made the vulnerability feel less like weakness and more like a shared strategy session against the uncertainties looming over both our lives. Yet as the conversation flowed toward lighter topics like her recent gigs creating logos for small businesses struggling post-pandemic, I tested the waters with hypothetical musings about what one might do with a sudden influx of cash during a crisis. Watching for any telltale greed in her expression, but detecting only a thoughtful pause before she recounted how her ex's gambling had squandered their savings, leaving her to rebuild from scratch with nothing but grit and a laptop, a story that resonated with my own post-divorce scramble, but also sparked a flicker of doubt because if she'd truly been out of the loop, why did her gaze linger on my modest surroundings as if appraising hidden depths beyond the visible wear and tear? Lisa's belated outreach arrived the next morning via email, a rambling apology laced with excuses about her hectic schedule at the library, where shelving books apparently trumped sibling bonds, the attachment a stock get-well image that screamed minimal effort, but buried in the metadata of the file was a glimpse of her browser history from a shared cloud link showing searches for debt relief alongside my name, confirming the loans I'd anonymously flagged were biting harder now with collection notices disrupting her facade of carefree posts about artisanal brunches and impulse buys. So with a mix of vindication and reluctance, I replied with curated advice pointing her toward nonprofit credit counseling, while weaving in subtle reminders of past favors like the time I'd covered her rent during one divorce without a peep, the response chain escalating into her defensive justifications that exposed cracks in her narrative about always being there for family. A clever online exposure through a pseudonymous comment on a local forum thread about predatory lending that tied her story to broader warnings without naming names, the thread gaining traction and forcing her to delete posts in a panic that reached me through mutual friends' whispers, leaving me with a wry sense of justice because what a bunch of selective memory holders they were, recalling my help only when their own backs were against the wall. Mike's hypocrisy bubbled up soon after during a rare group video call he initiated ostensibly to check on everyone, but really to fish for sympathy over his derailed property deal, his complaints about unfair inspections, ringing hollow as he pivoted to probing questions about my health that veered into offers of investment advice if I came into any windfalls, the opportunism so blatant it nearly made me snort into my tea, prompting me to steer the discussion toward family history with offhand mentions of Grandma's will that had him sweating and changing the subject abruptly, and capitalizing on that unease. I uploaded a redacted version of his old business filings to a real estate watchdog site under an anonymous account, highlighting inconsistencies in his claims that drew scrutiny from potential partners and landed him in a viral local news snippet about shady flips, the backlash hitting his inbox with demands for explanations that he blamed on me in a furious text, though I feigned innocence with a simple, "Hope you're okay" reply that masked the satisfaction of watching his bluster deflate like a punctured tire. As Ellie returned midweek to help with a doctor's appointment, her car stocked with healthy snacks and printouts of support resources she'd researched overnight, the bond strengthened through these acts of quiet reliability that stood in stark opposition to the rest of the family's radio silence. But the twist deepened when she confessed over lunch about once forging a minor document during her divorce to secure a small asset her ex tried to hide, framing it as a regrettable necessity born from desperation that echoed too closely with my own temptations to bend rules in this secrecy-laden limbo, her admission pulling a parallel story from me about covering for a coworker at the hospital with falsified shift logs during a staffing crisis to prevent burnout, though in truth it was a fabrication designed to gauge her reactions and probe if she suspected more about my circumstances. The exchange leaving us both reflective until she unveiled a scanned copy of the will addendum from her files, its clauses explicitly naming me as an alternate heir to a modest sum and heirloom jewelry that Uncle Jack had contested and suppressed, suggesting the family's indifference stemmed from ingrained patterns of favoritism dating back generations. That night, alone with the documents spread across my bed as rain pattered against the window like insistent questions, the moral grayness of my deceptions weighed heavier, pushing me toward a disagreeable choice to deepen the alliance with Ellie by sharing a fabricated detail about pursuing the inheritance claim independently, her enthusiastic support masking a subtle shift in her demeanor that hinted at personal stakes I hadn't fully grasped, especially when a nondescript envelope slipped under my door containing a clipping from an old newspaper about lottery scams with my winning numbers circled faintly. The anonymous sender's intent ambiguous enough to chill me because if Ellie or someone closer had connected the dots to my secret fortune, this olive branch of help might unravel into a demand that tested loyalties far beyond what I'd bargained for in my quest for reckoning. The anonymous envelope with its circled lottery numbers sat on my dresser like a venomous spider waiting to strike, its implications weaving through my thoughts during the sleepless hours when the arthritis flared worst, turning every joint into a battlefield that mirrored the internal war between clinging to my secrecy and the growing temptation to lash out more aggressively against the family, whose indifference had evolved from neglect into opportunistic sniffing around the edges of my concealed fortune, especially as whispers of my changed circumstances began circulating through the grapevine after Aunt Rita's loose-lipped inquiries at her bridge club prompted vague rumors that reached even the ears of distant cousins who'd long forgotten my name unless it involved borrowing tools or holiday leftovers. My doctor's follow-up appointment confirmed the decline with clinical detachment, prescribing stronger immunosuppressants that promised side effects like fatigue and mood swings, while warning that without lifestyle adjustments, perhaps a move south or early retirement, I risked permanent damage that could sideline me for good from the nursing career that had defined my identity even as it drained my body. The news hitting harder because Ellie's reliable presence had become a crutch I leaned on more than I'd admit, her daily check-ins evolving into joint planning sessions for my potential relocation, where she'd sketch rough maps of affordable Florida communities with her design software, her enthusiasm a balm against the isolation yet laced with questions about funding that skirted too close to probing my resources without outright demanding details. The family barbecue Rita insisted on hosting arrived like a storm cloud on the horizon, the annual affair at her sprawling backyard in the suburbs where charcoal smoke mingled with forced laughter and the clink of beer bottles, a tradition that had once fostered fleeting unity but now served as the perfect stage for my escalating bitterness to play out in calculated moves, so I attended despite the protest from my aching hips, dressed in loose clothes to accentuate my frailty and drawing sympathetic coos from the ants, while positioning myself near the grill where Mike held court with his latest pitch about eco-friendly home renovations that sounded as pie-in-the-sky as his previous flops. As conversations swirled around potato salad and the latest high school sports scandals, I slipped a small digital recorder into the pocket of the folding chair beside Mike's display easel, its timer set to activate during his big reveal to a cluster of potential investors Rita had invited from her church network, the device capturing his exaggerated claims about profit margins that I doctored slightly with overlaid audio from public records of his past fines for shoddy work, the playback triggering mid-presentation with a tinny echo of his own voice admitting to cutting corners in a clip I'd ethically sourced from an old interview, chaos erupting as the group murmured doubts and one investor pulled out his phone to verify the discrepancies, Mike's face flushing crimson like overcooked ribs while he stammered excuses about deepfakes and sabotage. The scene devolving into Rita's frantic mediation that had her spilling coleslaw in the shuffle, a witty orchestration of comeuppance that left me sipping lemonade from the sidelines with a suppressed grin because what a circus of entitled dreamers. They were unraveling at the first whiff of accountability after years of coasting on family goodwill that I'd supplied without tally. Lisa cornered me later by the dessert table, her eyes darting nervously as she whispered about hearing good news regarding my finances from a mutual friend who'd overheard Harlan's office chatter, her plea for a sisterly loan, to tide her over the latest loan shark threats delivered with feigned casualness that crumbled under my noncommittal nods, so I countered by casually mentioning the will addendum Ellie had shared, watching her composure crack as she denied any knowledge of Uncle Jack's maneuvers while fidgeting with her necklace, a cheap knockoff that suddenly seemed symbolic of the pilfered legacies. And in a subtle revenge, I texted Tom under the table to accidentally forward her debt details to the group chat as a warning about family scams, the notifications buzzing like angry hornets and sparking a sidebar argument where she accused everyone of betrayal, her exit in tears amid the fading daylight providing a hollow victory that tasted more like ash given the disagreeable thrill it sparked in me to manipulate these fractures further. Tom himself hovered awkwardly, his salesman's patter about needing seed money for a new venture masking desperation from his ongoing league woes and child support arrears, prompting me to suggest he pitch to Mike for old time's sake, the redirect igniting a brotherly spat over unresolved loans that pulled Rita into the fray with her own grievances about unpaid favors, the entire event splintering into smaller huddles of suspicion that isolated me not unpleasantly amid the thinning crowd, though the physical toll had my fingers throbbing by sunset, forcing an early departure where Ellie's offer to drive me home turned into a deeper discussion en route about accelerating the inheritance claim to fund my treatments. Back at my house with the porch light flickering like a hesitant confession, Ellie lingered over tea as I voiced the paranoia gnawing at me about the envelope and potential leaks, her reassurance flowing into an admission that she'd suspected my windfall from the start after a casino acquaintance mentioned a quiet big winner matching my description. The confession laced with her own vulnerability about how the suppressed will had left her destitute post-divorce, Uncle Jack's greed directly costing her the stability that might have prevented her ex's abandonment, and now, with this alliance, she proposed we confront the family together not for money but justice, her eyes fierce with a grudge that tied back to that buried family rift in a way that made my pulse quicken, because while her stake explained the depth of her help, it also raised the uncomfortable possibility that her loyalty was as much about settling old scores as genuine care, especially when she pulled from her bag a draft letter to Harlan outlining our joint pursuit, the final line hinting at revealing more secrets if the others pushed back, leaving me staring at the document in the lamplight wondering if this pact would empower my revenge or entangle me in a web where the lines between ally and avenger blurred beyond recognition just as a late-night knock echoed from the door, Lisa's silhouette visible through the glass with demands that shattered the fragile evening calm. Lisa's insistent knocking reverberated through the house like a drumbeat signaling the inevitable confrontation I'd both dreaded and orchestrated in the recesses of my mind during those long nights when the lottery's glow felt more like a curse than a cure. Her silhouette framed in the porch light with a mix of desperation and defiance that spoke volumes about the rumors she'd chased down through Rita's gossip mill and perhaps even a peek at my financial comings and goings via shared family accounts she'd always monitored more closely than her own conscience, so as Ellie and I exchanged a loaded glance over the draft letter still warm from the printer, I motioned for her to stay hidden in the kitchen while I opened the door to face the sister who'd morphed from childhood confidant into a symbol of selective loyalty that prioritized her fleeting comforts over the enduring support I'd provided through her life's parade of mishaps, from impulsive marriages to credit card binges that left her perpetually on the edge of ruin. She burst in without waiting for an invitation, her words tumbling out in a torrent of accusations and pleas about how she'd heard everything from a nurse friend at the hospital who overheard my consultations with specialists, twisting the narrative to paint my secrecy as a deliberate snub that justified her silence on my initial outreach. But beneath the bluster lay the raw hunger for a piece of what she assumed was my newfound stability, her eyes flicking to the modest furnishings as if calculating their resale value while she launched into a rehearsed sob story about the lenders closing in and her boyfriend's uselessness in a crisis. The performance so polished it almost elicited pity, if not for the fresh memory of her ignored texts that had echoed my own vulnerability during the darkest flares of my arthritis, when every step felt like wading through molasses. I let her ramble on the living room couch where family photos gathered dust on the mantel, their smiling faces a mocking backdrop to this unraveling, until the front door creaked open again without a knock to admit Mike, flanked by Tom and Rita in a show of united front that reeked of coordinated opportunism. Their arrival timed too perfectly after Lisa's frantic calls to suggest they'd been lying in wait for this moment to demand their share of the pie they now believed I'd baked in secret, Mike leading the charge with blustery claims about family first and how my windfall owed them recompense for past loans and emotional investments that conveniently omitted the times I'd footed those very bills without resentment. The room filling with overlapping voices that drowned out Ellie's subtle emergence from the shadows until she cleared her throat and laid the will addendum on the coffee table like a gauntlet thrown down, its yellowed pages detailing Uncle Jack's manipulations that had robbed us both of inheritances meant to level the playing field generations ago. The revelation sucking the air from the space as Lisa's face paled and Mike sputtered denials about inherited decisions he claimed ignorance of, though Rita's fidgeting and averted gaze betrayed the complicity that had festered unspoken at every reunion where we'd all pretended the past was buried deeper than Grandpa's old workbench in the garage. Seizing the momentum with a calm that belied the adrenaline surging through my veins despite the persistent throb in my knuckles, I activated the smart speaker on the side table to play a curated playlist of audio clips I'd compiled over weeks. Recordings of their brush-offs to my pleas interwoven with Harlan's digitized will excerpts and public filings exposing Mike's shady deals alongside Lisa's debt trails, all synced to project onto the wall via my laptop in a makeshift presentation that unfolded like a courtroom drama in my own home, the visuals highlighting timelines of their neglect juxtaposed against my quiet generosities from co-signing Mike's ventures to babysitting Lisa's kids during her wild phases, the clever twist lying in how I'd anonymized the inheritance claim already filed through Harlan to reclaim my share without alerting them until now. The onslaught forcing admissions and apologies that rang hollow as they fractured into blame-shifting arguments, with Tom accusing Mike of hoarding family lore and Rita defending the greater good of Jack's choices, the chaos peaking when Ellie revealed her stake in the suppressed assets that could have altered her post-divorce trajectory, her voice steady as she recounted how the betrayal had cascaded into her ex's abandonment and her solitary rebuild. A narrative that humanized our alliance in a way that isolated the others further, their opportunistic unity crumbling into individual retreats with promises of legal recourse they lacked the means to pursue. As the dust settled with them filing out into the night amid slammed doors and muttered threats that echoed hollowly down the driveway, Ellie and I shared a quiet toast with herbal tea on the porch where the cool air soothed my inflamed joints better than any pill. Her gift of the replica necklace from earlier, now joined by the real heirloom Harlan had retrieved from probate. Its weight in my palm, a tangible emblem of reclaimed fragments amid the wreckage. Though I confessed my own manipulations, the fabricated stories and anonymous tips that had tested not just them but her loyalty too, prompting a moment of raw reciprocity where she admitted sending the warning clipping not as a threat but a nudge toward transparency born from her fear of repeating family patterns of secrecy that had scarred us both. The exchange forging a bond tempered by mutual flaws yet leaving me to ponder if this revenge, witty and restorative as it felt in dismantling their facades without stooping to outright cruelty, had truly balanced the scales or merely deepened the chasms that money and grudges alike could never bridge. In the days that followed, with the family scattering like leaves in an autumn gale, cutting ties through blocked numbers and exclusion from group chats, while I quietly arranged my move to a sunny condo in Florida funded by the fortune's steady drip, the ambiguity settled over me like a persistent fog rolling off the Ohio River, wondering if Ellie's steadfast response stemmed from untainted kinship or the subtle calculus of shared victimhood that mirrored the very hypocrisies I'd exposed. The ultimate question lingering unanswered as I packed the last box, whether this path to independence healed the hollows left by betrayal or simply traded one isolation for another. Fortune's echoes reminding me that trust, once gambled and lost, echoes forever in the choices we make to walk alone or reach out once more into the uncertain light.